All right. If you have a New King James, you may have a header at the top of chapter 34 that says, the Dinah incident. Okay. I guess that's a way to talk about it. The Dinah incident, quote unquote, incident. Let me read this passage, and as I said, we'll talk about it. So please give your attention as I read God's word. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. His soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this young woman as a wife." And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it. And the men were grieved and were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it." Then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife." But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father and spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah their sister. And they said to them, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone." And their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. So the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city and spoke with the men of their city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it. For indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us." And all who went out of the gate of his city heeded Hamor and Shechem his son. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. And they killed Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. And they took sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, and what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth, all their little ones, and their wives they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed, my household and I." But they said, "Should he treat our sister like a harlot?" There you go. Thus far, the reading of God's holy word. Not exactly a passage that, if you're reading through a little daily devotional, I don't know if you're ever going to see a daily devotional on Genesis 34. And it's like, and here are the three lessons you can draw from Genesis 34 for this day. Be blessed. Not a passage for comfort. right? If I'm on my deathbed, please do not read to me Genesis 34. Just not one of those passages that if you are not committed to going verse by verse, chapter by chapter through books of the Bible, that you would treat upon. I don't know if I've ever really heard a sermon on Genesis 34, to be quite honest. Maybe you have, but it's an ugly chapter in the history of God's people here. Just to refresh our memories from last time, Genesis 33, we see that's the chapter in which Jacob is restored to his brother Esau. He meets Esau. They reconcile, right? And he, leaves that encounter by saying, when Esau was kind to him and showed him favors as if I seen the face of God. So the two brothers sort of reconcile. And in a sense, Jacob makes restitution to Esau having cheated him 20 years before by giving him a whole bunch of, if you remember the whole tribute that he sends to Esau. And then Esau wants him to come to his land and his home, but Jacob makes up some weird excuses to say we can't go there, and they part ways again. So, the relationship is better than it was before, but at least they're reconciled. And again, we see growth in Jacob, right? Jacob, who cheated his brother, who left the promised land and was kind of making deals with God. We see now Jacob showing deference to his older brother, bowing to him, right? Calling him my Lord, I am your servant, and so on. So there's growth in Jacob. Unfortunately, like in a lot of our lives, right, our sanctification tends to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Now what we see here in this chapter, it's more like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, right? Because let's just say Jacob does not come across very well in this chapter. In fact, let's just say there are no good guys in this chapter. There's no one. You only have victims and victimizers. That's kind of what you have in this chapter. So we see in this chapter Dinah, the one daughter that Jacob has of, so far Benjamin hasn't been born yet, so he has 12 children, 11 sons, and 1 daughter. So his only daughter, she is raped. And then we see 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, kind of go the extra mile, seeking vengeance for what had happened with their sister. And I think what you're going to see here is the lesson is titled, this is the downward spiral of sin, right? Compromises, half obedience, things like that lead to this situation that just seems to get worse the further you read this chapter. As each verse keeps going on, you're just like, okay, this is getting worse and worse and worse. And that's what we see here. Compromise with the world often leads to disastrous results. That's what we're going to see in this passage this morning, or this evening. I think, what do I have there? Four points on the outline? I think I have 4. Yep, looks like 4. Okay. So first we're going to see in verses 1 through 4 the rape of Dinah. There's no other way to put it other than this is a violation of Jacob's daughter. The story begins with this young lady. Just a guess, if you had to guess, how old do you think Dinah is?
14.
Did you look at your study Bible notes?
No.
Okay.
Was that a good guess?
About 13-ish, yeah, give or take. She's young, right? But she's, in that culture, that's marriageable age, right? So she is a young woman. She is approximately 13, 14 years old. It's just, sometimes you don't think about this because they don't often tell you the ages, right? It's like when when Jacob left and came to Paddan Aram to meet his wife, right? I was a little shocked when it was like Jacob was 77 when he did that, right? It's like, and he's moving this giant stone off of the well, right? So sometimes the ages of these people we're not told. Yeah, so she's a young woman. She's 13 years old. And I think it's safe to say that she finds herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? That's what it says here. The first verse says, "Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land." Now, I'm just going to go out there and say that Nothing good ever follows those words, okay? It's like once upon a time, Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, went out to see the women of the land, the daughters of the land. Why is she in the wrong place at the wrong time? Well, I think because Jacob didn't go all the way back to Bethel like he was expected to go. If you remember when he left the promised land to find a wife, to flee from Esau, he went and stopped at Bethel, and that's when he has that vision of God and the ladder, or the stairway to heaven, and God makes the promise to him. And so he builds an altar there and says, if you will bring me back, then you will be my God. And in the last chapter, in 33 verse 18, he stops short of going back to Bethel. He arrives in the town of Shechem, which is in the promised land, but not quite back at Bethel. Now again, he had the first encounter with God at Bethel in 28:15. Then in chapter 31, verse 13, when God calls him to return, he says to him, I am the God of Bethel, where I met you at Bethel. And then if we look at chapter 35, at the first verse, then God said to Jacob, arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there. God wanted Jacob to come back to the place that was called the house of God. Where did Jacob end up building a house? He built the house near the city. That's another thing we see in Genesis, right? Nothing good happens near cities. Does that sound? Does this ring a bell with someone earlier in the story of Genesis? Yeah, a lot in chapter 13 when they're in the promised land with Abraham and their herds are getting too big and their shepherds are kind of arguing with one another. And Abram comes to his nephew and says, we're family. We shouldn't have this fight. So, look at the land and, you pick a direction to go, and wherever you go, I'll go the other direction. So Lot looks out and he sees the cities of the valley, right? And he sees how they're well watered. In fact, he says, wow, these things, they're so well watered, they look as if the garden of God. It's almost like Eden down there. And of course, we're told that's where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are, right? So he goes and it says he pitches his tent outside of Sodom. And then by the time you get to chapter 14, he's inside Sodom. And by the time you get to chapter 19, he is in the gates of Sodom. He's got a high position in the city of Sodom. And we could tell, right? He was compromised, right? I mean, now Peter, we'll call him righteous Lot. It's like, okay, sure. If Peter says so, I guess we have to believe it. But he was compromised, right? When the angelic visitors came, what was Lot's first reaction? Don't violate my guests. Here, take my virgin daughters. It's like, no, what are you doing? It's like, no. Nothing good happens when you sit outside a city, apparently, either. So, Jacob's here half obedience. His compromise is staying near the city where there's people and there's commerce and there's activity going on. And he's kind of attracted to that and he stays there. It's kind of a half obedience. And as we're going to see, this is going to prove very disastrous to him and his family as the story commences. Now, we see that Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. It seems innocent until you realize a couple of things. First, Genesis, along with the rest of the Pentateuch, was written by who? Yeah, okay. Rhymes with Oses, starts with an M, Moses. Right, written by Moses. And the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, and they were written right as the Israelites are getting ready to enter what? The Promised Land, after being released from Egypt by God's mighty hand and his outstretched arm, and being guided through the wilderness for 40 years. They were given the covenant. Of course, the older generation dies off because of their disobedience, but in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is retelling the law, retelling the story of the people as they're about to enter this promised land. And of course, the book of Genesis, the events recorded in Genesis are way before Moses. But the point is, as they're about to enter this promised land, and the promised land is filled with what? A bunch of Canaanites, right? just as Jacob here is living next door to Canaanites. And part of this is Moses' warning is, as God's people, as God's special people, you are not to intermingle with the Canaanites. Right? In fact, they're going to go over there and they're going to pretty much wipe most of them out. That's the point. So you've got this idea here of warning about intermingling with non-believers, intermingling with pagan worshipers, and this is given by Moses as they're about to enter the Promised Land. Of course, they would be commanded to wipe out the Canaanites who dwelt there, not to intermix with them. And there's long-standing warning in the Bible for the people of God not to intermix with the world, right? We're not talking like interracial marriages. We're just talking like interfaith marriages, right? The people of God are to remain separate from the world in a sense that we are not to intermingle with the world, right? What does John say in 1 John 2:15? He says, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now, I do want to be clear. I don't want to play the blame the victim game here. Dinah is the victim in this, right? But I don't think she's completely innocent because, as I said earlier, nothing good ever begins with the words, now Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. Okay? So we see here, if you remember back in Genesis 6, how the depravity of man was growing right before the flood when God brings judgment. What are we told there? Well, it came to pass, Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now, we went through that, and there's a lot of debate as to what does that mean. In my opinion, I think the most sensible way to understand that is that you had the line of Seth, who is the godly line. You had the line of Cain, who is the ungodly line. And you had the sons of God, the godly line, intermingling with the sons of Cain, the ungodly line. And you had debauchery, right? So this intermarrying between those who worship the Lord and those who went after their own gods and such. Now, in all this, again, Dinah is 13. She's unmarried. She's in a strange city. She's in the wrong place at the wrong time. My question, of course, is where's her father? Where are her brothers? Where are people who would be guardians for this young woman, right? Where are the protectors? Now, the narrative adds a little bit of detail here, right? Verse 1 again. Dinah, the daughter of who? Leah. Which wife was she? The not favored wife. The unloved wife, right? The unloved wife. Now, we know that Jacob preferred Rachel over Leah. I don't know if he hated Leah. He just wanted Rachel. Do you think it's safe to assume that his feelings for Leah might have been transferred to the kids that she bore him? Possible, right? Compare the reactions, right? Okay, he finds out that Dinah, his only daughter, okay? Let's be clear about this. His only daughter, it's not like he had a whole bunch of daughters and one of them got raped. No, his only daughter got raped. I have one daughter. I think if she were raped, I think I'd have a little more emotional reaction than Jacob here. What do we see in verse 5? Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, and his sons were out in the field, so Jacob held his peace. What? Compare this, flip over a few chapters to chapter 37. Verse 34. This is Jacob's reaction after he finds out that his brothers, or his sons, report to him that Joseph, his favorite son, was killed by a lion. Now, of course, he wasn't killed, right? He was sold into slavery, but to cover their iniquity, the brothers lied. And they said, your son was, attacked by a lion and was torn to pieces. What was Jacob's reaction? In 34, he tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned his son for many days. Okay, you can say, well, his son was killed. Okay, granted. But your daughter was defiled. the reactions are very different. His favorite son, the only son at this time of his favorite wife, has been reported to him killed, and he goes into mourning for many days, rips his clothes as a sign of anguish. His only daughter is defiled. He holds his peace. So, I mean, all I'm saying is, I think it's plausible to suggest that perhaps his feelings for Leah might be transferred to some of the children of Leah. Where's Jacob? Why isn't she being protected? Where are the brothers? Why aren't the brothers guarding this girl? They're out working in the field. Jacob's at home, and his daughter is all by herself. So she's wandering the streets of Shechem, and Shechem, the son of Hamor is the guy who founded the city, so he names it after his son. He's a Hivite, so he's a Canaanite. And Shechem is the prince of the country. And we see here in verse 2, he saw her, took her, lay with her, and violated her. Very succinct. Just kind of, just even the way it's said, it just sounds very like, very, saw her, took her, lay with her, violated her. Just very forceful. They don't go into any gory details, but the language hints at the violence of the action. And then afterwards, kind of another interesting reaction. His soul was strongly attracted to her. Okay? To Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the young... did he love the young woman? Or is this lust talking? I think it's safe to say this is lust talking. This is not love. This is lust. Kind of reminds me of the story of David's son, right? You remember the story of Amnon and Tamar? In 2 Samuel, I want to say 12, 13, 14. David has many sons because David had many wives, and he has many sons of many wives. One of them is Amnon, and Amnon is, I believe, his oldest. I could be wrong on that. But he's got Tamar as his daughter from another wife, so half brother, half sister. Well, Amnon is like just jonesing for Tamar. It's like, I gotta have her. It's like, and he concocts this weird plan. It's like, I'm gonna pretend I'm sick, and I'm gonna say, I go to my dad. It's like, Dad, tell my sister to bring me cupcakes because I'm sick or something like that. And first of all, my thing is like, Dave's like, why? That's a weird, request. But anyway, when Amnon violates Tamar after he's done with the act, it says he hated her. It's like, okay, he had his way with her. It's like, I'm done. It's like, okay, you no longer please me. So at least Shechem here is attracted to the woman still after violating her. So he goes to his father. He says, get me this young woman as a wife. Does that sound familiar to you too? Think of a really strong guy with long hair. Samson, right? When he sees the Philistine woman, it's like he goes to his parents, get me that Philistine woman as my wife, right? Judges 14:2. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. If we ever get to Judges, I think we'll find out that Samson is kind of a stand-in for Israel at that time, how wicked they were. Samson's kind of reflective of that. He's supposed to be a Nazirite. He's supposed to avoid touching anything dead. He's supposed to avoid strong drink, and he's drinking and carousing and touching all kinds of dead things, right? He kills a lion and brings some of it to his parents to eat, and he's intermarrying with Philistines. So anyway, so here we have this the rape of Dinah. Now, it would be really nice to say if this is as bad as the story gets, but it's going to get a heck of a lot worse, right, as we go on here, because this is the downward spiral of sin. So Dinah is raped, and now we're about to see the overreaction to this rape. Now, I think sometimes in the Lord's providence, we are allowed to see some of the effects of our sin. Sometimes we're not, right? Sometimes we are, the Lord will take his hand away and let us, reap the full benefits of our sin at times. But as I said earlier, there are no good guys in this story so far, right? There are only those who have been victimized and those who are the victimizers. right? And it all begins, as I said, with a compromise. Because Jacob didn't go the rest of the way to Bethel and stays by Shechem, his half obedience, his compromise, leads to this disgusting, vile incident. Well, now in verses 5 through 12, we're going to see here the restitution of Shechem. So, as we see here, Jacob heard, we already saw Jacob's reaction. We noted this earlier. It bears repeating. How else can we explain Jacob's lackluster response to the fact that his only daughter is violated, other than the fact that she was the daughter of Leah, the wife who was unloved? It, of course, seems ghastly to even think that he would have this kind of a lackluster reaction, but I think it gets to the heart of what we see oftentimes, even so far in Genesis, is how bad partiality is as a sin, right? The fact that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob, that led to all kinds of family strife, right? The fact that Joseph was Jacob's favorite son of all of his children leads to all kinds of bad things, right? He gives him the coat, and his brothers are jealous. And of course, Joseph, I don't think is innocent in all this either. He's often, it's kind of seen as maybe he's out kind of spying on the brothers, tattling. It's like, did you see what the brothers did today? And so on and so forth. Partiality leads to just greater and greater sin. So after Jacob learns of the incident, Hamor, that's Shechem's father, comes to Jacob to plead on behalf of his son. That's what we see in verse 6. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And now the sons come in. Verse 7. Now the son's reaction is a little more appropriate, at least initially, right? When they hear of what happened, it says they were grieved, they were very angry, and they say he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. Now, I think what we see here, among other things, is the fact that even in our depraved state, we are still able to see some sins as sin, right? Even the unbelieving world will see certain things as that's wrong. If you think about in 1 Corinthians 5, when Paul is talking to the church there, and he's like, you've got something going on in this church that ought not to happen. He says, you've got a man who has his father's wife, right? So he's sleeping with his stepmother. And Paul says, even the pagans find that disgusting, right? In other words, it's such a grievous sin, even the unbelieving world around you is like, yeah, that's icky, right? That's kind of icky. You shouldn't be doing that. So here we see their response, as I said, a little more appropriate, I guess, because it is a disgraceful thing. It is a thing which ought not to be done. At least so far, it is a more appropriate response to the rape of Dinah than Jacob's. Unfortunately, it's going to lead to greater sin, as we saw when we read the passage. A couple of things about anger, right? The Bible tells us in Ephesians 4:26, be angry, but do not sin, right? Do not let the sun go down on your anger. James 1, verses 19 and 20. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Why? For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Anger is not always a bad thing. There is a righteous anger. The problem is the wrath of man does not lead to the righteousness of God, and that's what we're going to see here in this case. Hamor, of course, attempts to mollify the sons. He essentially what's going on here, as we'll see in a moment, is they are offering a dowry here. Okay, now I'm going to be the first to admit that Hamor's offer seems utterly foreign to me. Okay, because what does it amount to? Is the father is going. The father of the son is going to the father of the daughter and saying, let me pay the dowry for the woman that my son raped. Right? It's kind of what's going on here. Let me pay the dowry for the woman that my son raped. So it seems foreign to me. It's a foreign concept to me to offer a bride price for a woman that you raped. Yet, It seems like this was probably a custom back in the ancient Near East. And here's the reason why. A woman who is raped is seen as damaged goods, right? She's been violated. She's no longer a virgin. She would no longer receive a fair bride price, because that's the idea is when you were going to marry somebody, you would pay a bride price to the family of the daughter because of the lost labor and whatever else may come from that. You paid a bride price. Well, when you're paying that bride price, you're paying that for a virgin, right? You're paying that for an unmarried woman. And here's a woman who has been violated. In fact, even the Mosaic Law has customs for this. Exodus 22, verses 16 and 17. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. And then it's reiterated in Deuteronomy. If a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all her days. So from our perspective, it seems weird to force a woman who's been raped to be married by her rapist, right? I mean, but then, again, you have to kind of try, and I'm trying to understand the way it would work in this situation as well. Because once violated, Dinah would probably no longer be marriageable. So the thing to do to make restitution is to enforce, in a sense, the offender to pay the price and then take her to be his wife so that she would at least be provided for. Otherwise, she would not be provided. I guess the best way to consider this would be to consider this as sort of like an ancient Near East shotgun wedding. Okay? So if you're familiar with the idea of a shotgun wedding, right? In a sense, this is kind of a shotgun wedding. Now, all that aside, I'm not trying to excuse Shechem at all. What he did was disgraceful. What he did was a vile, wretched thing. But I think what we're seeing here is, at least according to the customs of the day, he is attempting to make things right. He is attempting to try to make restitution for what he had done. Now, but wait, there's more. Because in verses 9 and 10, it's not just to bring Dinah into the family to make her the wife of Shechem, but it's also to essentially become one big happy family. And make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters to yourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell, trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. Essentially, what this is an offer is to assimilate. It is to assimilate. It is to become one big happy family. You give us your daughters, we'll give you our daughters. We'll intermarry, we'll become one big happy family, and we'll share everything. Do you think this is something that the Lord wants for his people? No, not at all, right? The Lord forbids this in no uncertain terms. Deuteronomy 7, verse 3. Nor shall you make marriages with them, the Canaanites. You shall not give your daughters to their son, nor take their daughters for your son. Deuteronomy 7, verse 3. Now we see that's the command that was given in the Pentateuch, and we see that it was violated in the book of Judges. Remember, Judges is sort of like the Wild West of Israel, right? It's when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in the land. So Judges 3, verse 6 and 7. If you remember how Judges is structured, it's structured kind of, it comes right out of Joshua. So they are conquering the promised land. And then in chapter 3, you get like a prologue that begins the 7 cycles of the judges, these cycles in which the people do what is wicked. Then God oppresses them. He sends oppressors to punish them, and then they cry out, and then God sends a deliverer to deliver them. But as you know, sort of like as we're seeing in this downward spiral here, Judges, it's like each time it just gets worse and worse until the last judge is Samson, who is, well, kind of a vile man himself, right? But in Judges 3, verses 6 and 7, they were commanded not to make marriages with the Canaanites, but then what do we find out what happened? And they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Then New Testament passage, 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? So the offer was to assimilate, to become one big happy family, and implied in this offer also is a way to shortcut the promised land promise, right? Because God promised to give them this land. Now, with Shechem's offer to assimilate, he says you can take possessions in the land, you can possess the land, and you can have do business in it, and you can live in it, and we'll grow in it together. So in a sense, it's a way to shortcut the promises of God. God will give them the land, but it's got to be in His way and His timing, right? So here we see the spiral of sin continues downward. That Jacob would even entertain an offer of assimilating with the Shechemites is unthinkable. His lack of response to the news of his daughter's rape is also equally unthinkable. And as we'll see, Jacob's sons are planning something far worse, right? So we'll get to their counteroffer in a moment. And the only positive thing, and I put positive in quotes because it's still kind of icky, is at least Shechem is attempting to do the right thing by making restitution here. But I think what we see here in this passage, and as we'll see in a moment even later, is that even God's people can act very worldly. Even God's people can fall into grievous sin. So now 13 through 29, we see the deceit of Simeon and Levi. So Hamor makes his offer, and the sons of Jacob have a counteroffer. I hear your offer. I'm going to make a counteroffer. So verse 13, but the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father and spoke deceitfully. Who's the deceiver? Jacob, right? Isn't that Jacob's kind of forte? Deceiving, deception, right? Lying to his father, And then we saw that Jacob got a little bit of his own medicine from his uncle Laban when Laban lied to him. Seems like it seems a lot of times what we see in the Genesis account is that the sons repeat the sins of the father, right? Just as Abraham went into every city and said of Sarah, "This is my sister." Well, Isaac did the same thing. And just as Jacob lied to get the blessing, well, Jacob's sons are lying as well. They are deceitful as well. So they treat them deceitfully, and because they had defiled Dinah, the sister. Now, I'm just going to stop here and say, okay, just because the sister was raped does not condone being, deceitful back, right? One sin does not condone other sins. Now, we see here Jacob's sons commit, I think, two grave sins. The first, obviously, is deceiving Hamor, that they would honor the request upon filling certain conditions, right? Because what was the condition here? It says, we'll give her to you, but you got to do one thing. You have to be circumcised like we are, right? It says, if every man in your city will circumcise himself, then we will take your daughters and so on, and we'll intermarry and so on and so forth and become one people. So the first sin was lying, because we know what they're going to do. We've read the rest of the story. The second sin is in the way they're treating the covenant of circumcision. Okay? What is circumcision? Circumcision was a sign that God gave to Abraham as a sign of the covenant. He said, if you will be circumcised and circumcise every male in your family, I will give you this land as a possession, as an eternal possession. So it's a sign of the covenant, and what Jacob's sons are doing are defiling the sign of the covenant, cheapening it to use it for their own way to get their revenge. It would be as if in the New Testament version, if you said, yeah, sure, as long as, we'll intermarry as long as you baptize everybody, and then as you go to baptize them, you kind of start drowning all of them, right? That's kind of what I think is kind of going on here. So they're defiling the sign of the covenant. This was a sign and seal of the Abrahamic covenant and marked one off as a member of God's covenant people. right? The blessings of the covenant come to those who are circumcised, to those who are part of the people of God. Now, it doesn't mean you're saved if you're circumcised, but the blessings that you get for obedience to the Mosaic covenant come to those who are circumcised as part of the covenant people. So what should be a sacred sign was used to deceive Shechem and Hamor. Moreover, they were not at all interested in becoming one people, because what would have been the proper way to do this if you're going to invite people to come into the covenant community? If we're going to invite people to come into the church, what's the proper way to do that? Right? You evangelize them, right? You go and you preach the good news that blessings will come to those who are of the people of Abraham. Those who bless Abraham will be blessed by God, and so on and so forth. So if they were to convert, if they were then to take on the sign of circumcision in a more legitimate manner, then you can be one people. But what they were intending here was not to become one people. In fact, they were intending for them to, as we'll see in a moment, be in such a situation where they could not fight back, right? That's the whole idea of what's going on here. Now, it's not that Shechem and Hamor have the purest of motives too, right? In verses 18 through 24, as they agree to this condition, yes, we'll do it. Shechem is pleased. It's like, we'll do it today. So they go, and they go to the city gate, and they talk to the elders, and then it's like, we made a deal with these Israelites, and if we all circumcise ourselves, they'll be with us, and we'll be one big happy family. And it's like, and won't their cattle and won't their livestock look good in our stalls and everything? It's like, they're not. It's not just an intermarriage thing here, right? They're looking at their possessions and thinking it would be great if we can absorb this into our community, right? That's the whole idea here. They're not interested in adding Dinah to their family, but also absorbing the wealth of Jacob and his sons. And God had blessed Jacob, right, greatly. And if you remember from the last chapter, how much stuff did he give away to his brother Esau? And even still, he's got a lot left over. And now we see here the vengeance of Simeon and Levi in the remaining verses 25 through 29. So it came to pass on the third day, this is a bad use of the third day, they were in pain, and two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi. Not sure why Reuben, the oldest, wasn't involved in this. But then Reuben's kind of a tool anyway, right? I mean, that's what we find out later, right? Reuben's a bit of let's just say he's not the bestest of first sons. So number 2 and number 3 son. So they wait 3 days, and they go out and they ambush the city, slaughtering all the men of the city. And that's not all. Then the other sons get in and they plunder the city. So Simeon and Levi go and they slaughter every man in the city. And then the rest of the sons plunder all the wealth and take captive all the children and all the women. Now, let me ask you this. Does that seem like a fair retribution for raping the daughter? I think that's a bit of overkill, a little bit, don't you think? I think that's a bit. Anybody here see the movie The Untouchables with Kevin Costner as Elliot Ness in the... Okay, is my wife the only one who's seen that one? Another movie reference. That's from the 80s, okay? So we're talking a movie that's like 40 years old. If you don't know the story, it's the story of Elliot Ness, and he's trying to break the Al Capone gang. And Sean Connery's in this movie, and he plays a Chicago cop who's not dirty, but he knows that the police force is very dirty. And Costner, as Elliot Ness, is trying to do things by the book, right? But he realizes he can't do things by the book and win. He keeps losing because he can't, Sean Connery says, well, what are you willing to do? It's like, you got to be willing to do things that you may not want to do. It's like, if they put one of yours in the hospital, you got to put one of theirs in the morgue, right? And I think that's kind of what's going on here in this story. It's like, it's what Shechem did was evil, okay? I'm not making any excuses for that, but what Levi and Simeon did was worse, because they slaughtered an entire city out of vengeance, right? This is not justice. This is not justice at all. It's pure vengeance, and the punishment certainly did not fit the crime. The downward spiral of sin, right? Shechem rapes Dinah. Simeon and Levi kill all the male Shechemites. Jacob's sons plunder the city and take the women and children captive. It's just a situation that got worse and worse and worse as we go down and down and down the spiral here. It's kind of why God says, leave vengeance to me, right? We're bad at taking vengeance because we often, that's why, in the law of God, you have the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The reason that's in there is because what is our tendency? Is to take eye for tooth, life for eye, things like that. We tend to over correct on these things. But God reserves vengeance for himself. Making matters worse, of course, as I said, was using the sacrament of circumcision as a tool in this deception. And as I said, there are no good people here. Well, finally, and a little more briefly here, we see the dismay of Jacob in verses 30 and 31. So here you have Jacob's response to what happens, right? So he finds out what happens, and what's Jacob's response? Is he concerned that his sons went a little overboard in the vengeance-taking category? Not really. He's a little more concerned about how this is going to look on him. It's like you've made me it's like you have made me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land. Notice how many times he says me and I. You have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land and the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me, and I shall be destroyed, my household and I. That's 8 times I counted. Okay? Me, I, me, my, I, me, mine. Right? That's Jacob. Has he really grown? It seems like he's taken a step back in this scenario, right? I, me, my. All he's concerned about is how this looks on me. But Simeon and Levi have a different view here. They ask a question that, interestingly enough, at the end of the chapter goes unanswered. Should he treat our sister like a harlot? And Jacob says nothing. Very interesting reaction there. Jacob says nothing. And then you have the sins of the father kind of revisited here. Because later on, as we get to chapter 49, near the end of the book, Jacob is near death, right? And he is giving the patriarchal blessing to the 12 sons. Benjamin is born by this time. And it's interesting what he says about Simeon and Levi, right? In Genesis 49, verses 5 through 7, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So obviously Jacob, in his old age, as he's about to die, did not forget this, right? And his blessing, if you will, was to say that when the land is allotted to you, Simeon and Levi are going to be scattered. And that's exactly what happens, right? The Levites have no possession in the land. Why? Well, first of all, they're God's possession, right? They're there to serve God. But, the Levites don't have an inheritance in the land, right? They're all over the place, right? They're wherever there's a gathering, wherever there's a synagogue, wherever there's a place of worship, the Levites are there. So they're scattered throughout the land of Israel. Of course, the Lord is their inheritance, but this prophecy, in a sense, comes true. Reuben is also not really have an inheritance. He kind of dwells within the land of Judah as when they separate the land. Now, as we bring this to a close, a couple things. One, obviously, God's people can sin and sin grievously, but God is true to his word, right? When, as Paul says in Timothy, he says, even though we are faithless, he is faithful, right? As we're going to see in chapter 35, Jacob's going to take a couple of steps forward again, right? So, and that's like us in our sanctification, right? It's like we will sin and sin grievously, and then we'll repent before the Lord, and the Lord restores to us the joy of our salvation. There's going to be good things coming in chapter 35. But as we see here at the end of chapter 34, what good can possibly come out of this ugly affair? What we see here is sin is real. Depravity runs deep, even in God's people. How serious is sin? Well, it's going to take the death of the Son of God, right, to atone for our sins. That's the thing. It's going to take the death of God's very own Son. He's going to send His Son into the world to be mistreated, to be abused, to be beaten, to be spit upon, to be whipped within an inch of His life, and to hang on a cross. He's going to allow His Son to do that. Why? Because He loves the world. And through that gruesome, vicious death, it's going to atone for our sins. I'm reminded of the parable that Jesus tells later in the Gospels, where He talks about the vineyard and the vineyard owners, right? And it says that a man leased out a piece of land to some vineyard keepers, and then when he went to collect from them, they beat the servants, right? He sent more servants, and they beat some, killed others, and so on. And then the owner of the land says, "I will send my son. Surely they'll respect my son," right? And then the son comes, and then the tenants are like, "This is the son. Let's kill him, and then we'll get the inheritance," right? And he's telling this to the Pharisees, right? The very people who are going to beat and kill the Son of God, knowing, the Pharisees are, they have to be thinking, it's like, you've got to be talking about us, right? And that's exactly what's going to happen here. These things, you're not going to atone for sin by wiping out an entire city full of people because they raped your sister. That's not how you atone for sin, right? That's just compounding sin upon sin. What we see here is that the only way to atone for these sins, the only way to actually fix the problem of sin and evil is through the death of God's Son. And I think, as we've seen, another lesson we see here is every time the people of God in Genesis take matters into their own hands, how well does it turn out? It turns out horribly, right? From bad to worse. Things fall apart. But if we trust in the Lord and we trust that He will work things out in His timing according to His will, that's when we get the blessing. So